On behalf of the League of Women Voters, St. Cloud area, welcome to this forum featuring candidates for State Legislative District 13. District 13 is represented in the Minnesota legislature by 1 senator and 2 representatives, 1 each for District 13A and District 13B. This event is being conducted in the City of Sartell Community Center, and we thank city staff for making arrangements to meet here. We are recording this event and will create a link on our website for online viewing. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. This means we do not support or oppose particular parties or individual candidates, but we do study and take positions on issues. We sponsor candidate forums because we believe informed citizens are the foundation of democracy. I am Ann Fleming, a member of the St. Cloud Area League, and I will moderate this forum. Susan Smith and Linda Salp will be the timekeepers. We moderate candidate forums according to a standard protocol that is designed to be fair and open. The candidates have accepted the format in advance. Ordinarily, we invite audience members to ask questions. In 2020, however, due to safety concerns associated with COVID-19, this forum will not have an in-person audience. Instead, we solicited questions from the public and compiled questions in advance. Questions of a related nature have been condensed and combined. All questions asked will be relevant to specific issues the candidates would normally address as legislative members. Each candidate will have the opportunity to answer all questions. All candidates who filed for District 13 races were invited to participate. Candidates for Senate District 13 are Jeff Howe and Michael Williamson. Candidates for House District 13A are Lisa DeMuth and Katy Westlund. Candidates for House District 13B are Benjamin Carollo and Tim O'Driscoll. Candidates who declined to participate in person were invited to submit a 2-minute statement to be read tonight. We have received no candidate statements. I am very pleased, however, to welcome and introduce the candidates who are participating in this event. We have Katy Westlund running for House District 13A and Benjamin Carollo running for House District 13B. The candidates' opening statements will be offered in the order they are seated, starting to my right. After that, the order for answering will be rotated. Candidates, you will each be allowed the following amounts of time: 1 minute for an opening statement, 1.5 minutes to answer each question, and 1 minute for a closing statement at the end of the question and answer period. A timekeeper will hold up a yellow card when you have 30 seconds left. The red card that says time means finish your sentence and stop. State legislatures have an important responsibility to represent their districts and to enact laws that pertain to Minnesota as a whole. Senators are elected for 4-year terms, and representatives serve 2-year terms. Candidates, we are ready to begin the opening remarks. You will each have 1 minute to state why you are seeking the office of Minnesota Legislature. We will begin with Katy.
Hello, my name's Katy Westlund, and I'm running for 13A. And I'm looking forward to representing the farmers, the families, and the small businesses in our community. And I'm here to represent the people. You know, I'm not here to represent the corporations, the people that make over $500,000. I'm here to represent the people. My day job, I work for NetSecurus, which is a cybersecurity company, and we protect utilities and chemical facilities. And so we work a lot with the DHS and other entities that keep us safe. So my main goal is to make sure that I secure hope for our rural communities. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ben?
Yeah, so the reason why I decided to run for office is it's primarily because I honestly don't think there are enough representatives that I truly believe are aiming to represent, regular working class Americans. And unfortunately, the already existing inequality in our society has only been compounded by this coronavirus pandemic. And oddly enough, I am finishing my master's degree in biosecurity and biodefense in about a month from now. And that will give me some, I guess, unique background and experience to hopefully get to the legislature and make sure that not only do we respond to this pandemic and, improve our response efforts, but also to try and make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again. And so really, I mean, this whole pandemic and everything that's happening this year, especially with the expanding inequality, has really just strengthened my resolve and pushed me more towards really wanting to make sure that there's real representation for working class folks in the legislature.
Thank you. Your first question, and Ben, we will start with you. What, if anything, should the legislature do to promote green energy and strengthen the clean power plant?
So there's kind of a lot that we can do. The state legislature has a lot of tools at its disposal in order to address this. And I think for starters, we need to open up potentially like revenue bonds to particular companies. Maybe if people want to, set up like cooperative solar or things like that. That way the community can have direct control over it if it's in the form of a co-op, but it can also have some financing that's made a little bit easier and available to them through the state at relatively low interest rates. That's one specific solution, but ultimately we need an all hands on deck approach when it comes to stopping climate change and making sure that we're protecting our environment and moving to green energy. And so that really means making sure that we're not putting any money or giving any subsidies to the fossil fuels, and that we're putting as much money and resources that we can to make sure that we're creating a lot of green jobs here in our state to make sure that not only are we moving to a green economy, but also we're creating jobs in the process and making sure that it is Minnesotans that are benefiting from any type of development effort to reduce our carbon footprint as a state. We're already in the lead, and I think that Minnesota can take that lead a little bit further when it comes to moving forward on green energy.
Thank you. Katy, and if ever you need me to repeat the question, I'm happy to do that. Would you like me? Okay. What, if anything, should the legislature do to promote green energy and strengthen the clean power plant?
So a lot of this comes down to our communities and what we value as Minnesotans. And we like to do our fishing, we like to do our hunting, and all of those items require a clean environment to do that in. We need to make sure that we are holding polluters accountable, and we need to make sure that we make strides towards green energy. One of the things that would work best, even in resiliency as well, is making sure that we have microgrids. So a microgrid is better for resiliency and making sure that if the heat goes off or the lights go off, that the heat can still, or you can get up and running faster. So if there is a hacker attack and it wipes out part of our electrical grid, if that was in a microgrid, we would be able to get up and running faster, and we would be without power for shorter time. The other thing that could happen is if we end up getting taken out by a tornado, and a tornado takes out a very large area. If we have a microgrid set up with wind or solar that's community-based, it's better for the community, provides more jobs, it's cleaner energy, and if there were to be a natural disaster, those individual communities could get up and running faster. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question. After the 2020 census, the Minnesota legislature will redraw our U.S. Senate districts, as well as the state's 67 Senate districts. Given that previous redistricting attempts have ended in the courts because the legislature and governor did not agree, and here's the question, what do you think about Minnesota shifting to an independent redistricting commission? And we'll start with Katy.
After I already put my mask up. So the area that I'm in, 13A, is very heavily gerrymandered. And we have had Republican representation for about 10 years. 10 years have gone by. Our taxes are not lower. Our schools are not doing better. Our Main Street businesses are really struggling. And so I think we really need a Democrat to represent us rurally and make sure that we can secure hope for the future and make sure that everyone is in a better situation moving forward. So I just really hope that yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Ben, do you need me to repeat the question?
No. So
Okay.
as far as it comes to an independent commission, one of the unfortunate realities that we live in today is that, people who are supposed to be independent, they all have their own views. We're all human, right? So even an independent commission isn't going to be truly independent. And that's actually one of the reasons why I'm a strong supporter of committing to basically an algorithm, right? With all the advances in computer science that we have today, it would actually be relatively easy to put together a pretty simple program that actually draws districts for us itself. Because, here in Minnesota, let's be fair, right? Minnesota is a leaning blue state, but there's roughly the same amount of Democrats and Republicans across the state, and we should probably see that level of representation in the legislature. I think it's kind of nice and unique to be one of the few states with sort of constant back and forth in at least the legislature, and so I think we really need to make sure that we put together something that we can use in the future over the long term, and something like an algorithm that can actually sit and be independent and draw districts, based on basically where people are, located, right? Like it's quite literally that easy. It only gets complicated when you add in the factor of representatives trying to draw districts for themselves. And so that's why I don't quite support a commission, but I like the idea.
Thank you. All right, now, Ben, we're going to start with you. How would you rate Minnesota's ability to ensure safe, secure elections and to provide equitable voter access, and why?
So Minnesota is already one of the best in the country, if not the best. But there's always room for growth. And there's a multitude of things that we could do to improve access to the ballot box. A lot of programs have their own faults and their own successes. And to be entirely honest, I think we're mostly on the right track. We're on the right track here in Minnesota, and we don't really need to shake things up too much. And that's one of those things where I'm going to honestly admit that I don't have a ton of expertise of how we can reach specific communities. It's always going to be a struggle for especially people who are struggling with homelessness to make sure that they can get to the ballot box in November. And, there's always going to be people that sort of fall through the cracks of the systems that we put together. And so that's really where I would just want to, continue to put the Secretary of State to task in making sure that every single person has access to the ballot box. And that we're doing our best to make sure that people are registered to vote and people are showing up in November. Even if they're not too excited about the top of the ballot, I know this year has been chaotic. There's plenty of people to vote for. And my hope is that Minnesota continues its long record of being one of the best states in terms of voter turnout and registration.
Thank you. Katy, you want me to repeat the question?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I wrote it down. So I really like what Ben said. I would say that we have a long way to go yet as far as making sure that every Minnesotan can vote. I know when I have volunteered, I have driven people to the polls to make sure that they can get there. But we have assisted livings, and we have nursing homes, and we have homes that live in vulnerable adults that live in homes, and of course the homeless. And I believe that everybody should have a vote, and it should be really easy. What I would like to see is have all ballots mailed out. Everybody in Minnesota that is eligible to vote would get a ballot. This is especially important with entity or people that don't know that they can vote. So if you are a person who has a felony but has fulfilled all of your necessary requirements, you can vote. Many people don't realize that. If we just sent out ballots proactively and made sure that everybody can vote that is able to, that would go a long way. We should also have voting or balloting out at homeless encampments, and then also in tribal areas where people may have a difficult time getting to the polls. We should also have community systems where people who cannot, that don't typically have a mailing address, have a way to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. And Katie, we're going to start with you with the next question. How would you approach balancing the state budget given the revenue shortfall during the pandemic? And as I said, Katie, we'll start with you.
So this is a huge issue that we're going to come up against, and it's not an issue that is going to go away. This is going to continue to snowball. We need to make sure that everyone is paying their fair share. Right now, the way it is that corporations and people that make a lot of money because of their resources to people that know how to file taxes properly and get those extra benefits do not pay their fair share. And that really needs to change. We do need to make sure that people are paying their fair share. We need to make sure that we're not giving special breaks and benefits to large companies that are big box stores. So if a big box store comes into a community and says, hey, we want this break in order to make sure that we can build this building and provide these minimum wage jobs for your community members, those same benefits need to be offered to our local small businesses. So all of that goes together, all of that is connected, and we can make strides by making sure that we take all of that into account. That way we all have a fairer tax system.
Thank you. Ben.
Yeah, so there's actually a really interesting solution to this because one of the things that states can't do, or that is most states can't do, and it's what the federal government does, where it basically finances itself through a bank and uses a lot of lending and money creation systems in order to operate on a deficit on a regular basis. And one of the ways that states could actually do that themselves is that if they actually establish state banks. And that's actually one thing that I think is absolutely necessary, especially right now, because what we have seen in the past is we've seen other states basically when they get into a short-term deficit, what they will do is they'll start cutting services, they'll start underfunding roads, which means less construction, which means less development, which means, an entire sort of downward spiral of both services and economic growth. And then you actually get into the negative direction, and then all of a sudden you realize that a lot of the things that we have depended on as Minnesotans would start slipping away. And so one of the ways to get around that is to set up a state bank, and it would actually be a lot cheaper than most people recognize because you could set it up mostly virtually where the overhead is really low, and you could even utilize some of the existing infrastructure by connecting it to some of the credit unions that already exist. And additionally, you could help people with their individual finances by basically replacing the entire payday lending market, which usually charges people absurd interest rates, and give people access to very, very low interest short-term loans.
Thank you. And Ben, we'll go back to you for this next question. What is your position on the influx of outside money into legislative elections?
Yeah, so that's one of those things that's honestly a big frustration. And I want to say this, like, not just on my own personal behalf. I don't think that there's been a ton of money flowing into our district. But it is a reality. It is a reality. And one of the things that I want to make sure is that Minnesotans are represented, by their representatives. And there's not tons of money coming from the outside. This is one of the reasons why I want, a publicly financed campaign system where basically, right now what exists is the political contribution refund, where people basically get $50 back from the state if they donate $50 to a political campaign. And what I want to increase that amount and actually turn it into a voucher instead of a payback program, so that way, if you sort of force candidates to only use that money, and sort of like don't let the other like PAC money come into our state, then what ends up happening basically is that representatives actually have to earn the support of their own constituents to get them to use that voucher money to fund their campaigns. And in that way, right, Republicans are going to have an advantage in Republican areas, and Democrats are going to have an advantage in Democratic areas. But other than that, they're basically going to be on an even playing field. I mean, and it's democracy anyway, right? When you're counting votes, Republicans are going to have an advantage in Republican areas, and Democrats are going to have an advantage in Democratic areas. And I really think that's the only fair way to fund our campaigns.
Thank you. Katy?
So I do agree with Ben's idea on the voucher system. As a first-time runner, I did reach out to a lot of friends that I grew up with, and not all of them have a huge amount of money. And so they might be able to donate $50 on their paycheck, or $5 or $10, and then turn in that receipt, the PCR receipt, and then get a check back is what happens right now. If we had funding to send out to each voter and say, here, use this towards whatever candidate that you support the most, that will make fairer elections, because it will empower people who wouldn't normally run to run, because they know that if they have the best policy, they can win, right? Because they will have money from the people that support them. And I got 30 seconds. And so that's super important to have a voucher system in place. If you coupled that with ranked choice voting, that would also make a big difference in making sure that money stays out of politics, because it levels the playing field. We need to have a limit on any out-of-state groups that donate as well.
Thank you. And Katy, we'll start with you for this next question. Discuss your thoughts about the legislature appropriating funds to assist Minnesotans with getting a safe, effective COVID-19 vaccine when available at little to no cost.
I think that's a great idea for the people that would like to get vaccines. I am a firm believer in rights, so if somebody chooses to not get a vaccine, I would fully support that they could choose not to get a vaccine without repercussions for that decision.
All right, thank you. Ben?
Yeah, so, and this is one of those things that's really important to understand about vaccinations, is that they really only work if and only if a significant percentage of the population is getting them. So it is to the benefit of all of us for a significant percentage of people to actually have that vaccine. And that's really the story with public health in general. Like, trust me, I know, right? This is what I spend a lot of time working on my master's degree, is exactly this issue, is how do you make sure that you keep a population safe from something like a pandemic like we're going through right now. And ultimately, if you want to make sure that you stop the spread of something as contagious as COVID-19, you really have to have somewhere around 80% of the population to have that vaccination. And so that's one of those things where, because it is necessary in order for it to really even be effective, it should just be free, right? It should be 100% free And not only the vaccination for the coronavirus, right, should it come out and whenever it eventually does, but also I think, annual flu shots. I think annual flu shots should be 100% free to the public. And I think there's a lot of creative ways to do that. You could basically reimburse CVS pharmacies or what have you, like your local pharmacy for administering vaccines or whatever clinic that you might go to. So that way in everybody's community, there would be an accessible place for them to be able to get, vaccinated.
Thank you. Now, Ben, we'll start again with you. In your opinion, what should be the size of the bond bill and what things should be prioritized?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. And when you're talking about priorities, it's already really difficult. I mean, so for example, there are, I think, a couple hundred deficient bridges and dams here in the state of Minnesota. And those have been underfooted for an incredibly long period of time. I mean, they're really just on the edge, and they're categorized as deficient for a reason, right? And the longer we wait, the more expensive it's going to be. Ultimately, there's a lot of costs that we simply have to cover. I mean, there's a lot of Minnesotans right now that are literally losing their health care. They're losing jobs left and right. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I said earlier that I supported the creation of State Bank so that we could go into a temporary deficit and not have to worry about some of this, is really because that's the real question. We don't know how big the bonding bill is going to have to be. There's always going to have to be some sacrifices, and the only way to get around that is through creative financing. And ultimately, I think we just need to engage in a strategy like that, because with something like a state bank, you could actually create options of basically flexible bonds and flexible financing systems in order to make sure that as things are needed, cities, counties would be able to actually get bonds relatively easy for themselves through that state bank. And if people set up savings account through the state bank, it would actually create basically guaranteed buyers, and it could give people a little bit of interest actually on their savings.
Thank you. Katy.
So I'm really pretty upset that the bonding bill did not go through. I do not know what the appropriate amount would be for the bonding bill. We definitely need adequate funds for roads and bridges. And one of the things that people don't usually think about is the critical infrastructure of our cooperatives, of our electric and gas out in rural communities. We also need very stable internet. We do not have stable internet. Out in Painesville, there is days where we don't have any internet at all, and that can ruin a complete work day sometimes. Out in Painesville, there was a gas line that was hit. We were without power for 2 days. And so a lot of the infrastructure out in rural areas is really crumbling in the main cities. So that really needs to be addressed. There is so many things that needs to be addressed that hasn't been addressed by our current legislature. And it's disastrous. People die from not doing your job. So the bonding bill is super important. We all do better when we all do better, and we need to make sure that those funds are available for our communities.
Thank you. And Katy, we're going to start with you with this next question. Last session, there was considerable discussion about gun regulations, but no resolutions. What changes, if any, are needed?
So we do live in Minnesota, and a lot of our outdoor activities revolve around hunting out where I live. My family hunts. I think it's very important for resiliency in the event that there was any kind of disaster. And as far as guns go, my dad was a police officer. He was also a firefighter, and and guns are part of my family life. So it's a very sticky issue. I think that there does need to be some kind of common sense structures in place, but I don't necessarily have an exact answer for what. And I think that's up to all of our communities to step forth and take action towards the things that they care about. So whether you are a parent that has children at school and you're concerned about guns, if you are a hunter and you want to make sure that your gun rights are secured, the state legislature needs to know about that. And we need to make sure that we have representatives that are there to represent us and not the NRA.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, so personally, I actually think Minnesota is in a pretty good spot when it comes to where we are in terms of gun regulations. We're one of the safer states, right? I think we're actually one of the safest states. And yeah, there's a lot of gun owners. I think really when it comes to gun rights for me, the big issue that I care about is kind of more of a mechanical one. And it's more about making sure that whenever people are going through a background check, that process is is both fast and transparent, right? In the age of the internet, there's not really a reason for a background check to take more than a couple hours or a few minutes. And, ideally, if somebody doesn't clear a background check, they should probably get a report and maybe a phone number for them to call to try and resolve that in a relatively short period of time, if it is something that they could resolve in a short period of time. Obviously, if somebody's convicted of a violent felony, we don't want that person to necessarily get a gun. And Minnesota does a pretty good job at this point at making sure that in fact is the case. And so, yeah, ultimately, I think where Minnesota is at in terms of gun legislation, I don't think there's much need for change other than just tweaking some of the processes. And ultimately, I think most of that could be done at the level of process and not necessarily at the level of legislation.
Thank you. And Ben, we'll start with this next question with you. What, if anything, can the legislature do to support schools struggling to stay open and safe during the pandemic, including supporting equal access to technology for remote learning? And we'll start with you, Ben.
Yeah, most definitely. One of the situations that we're in, I mean, and like, I'll be really frank, right? When I was growing up, I depended a lot on like free school lunches. And there are a lot of kids today that depend on these free school lunches. And so I personally think that we should get really creative with schools and basically have like a halfway opening. The UK basically did something similar where they opened all the schools, but basically all the parents that could afford to do like stay-at-home learning, that is what they did. And they did like remote classes via Zoom with some of the teachers. So that way there was basically more space and more room for social distancing in the schools for the students that had to show up and really depended on those free lunches. And in certain circumstances, somebody might like be at home, right, doing distance learning, but they might not have access to a computer or the internet. And I think what we really need to do at the state legislative level is basically just make sure that every single student has access to, I mean, even something like a Chromebook. I mean, those things are literally only a couple $100s. And so I think education is literally one of the few things that is written out in the state constitution. And we have a responsibility. Every state representative has a moral responsibility to make sure that every single student in our state has access to the education that they need. And if that means buying them a Chromebook and a mobile hotspot, then that's what it means.
Thank you. Katy.
I'm going to add to Ben's. I'm going to add to Ben's. Try that again. I'm going to add to Ben's adamant about making sure that every student has adequate access. And rurally, we don't have that because we don't have internet that is reliable. So part of that equation is making sure that we have secure and adequate internet that's fast out in the rural areas. We need to make sure that all the students have the resources that they need, and that includes school lunches. What I would like to see ultimately happen, because I do not think that this is necessarily going to go away, after COVID is done, there could quite certainly be another type of disaster like this. And so we need to be prepared for that next issue. And the class sizes have gotten extremely big. If you have a class that has 30 students in it, that's too big. So I would like to see the schools adapt to this social distancing to make sure that there's one teacher that has maybe 15 students that are socially distanced. And so we need to adjust our school system to accommodate the way our lives are changing.
Thank you. And Katie, we're going to come back to you now with this question. What will you do, if anything, to evaluate and update policies concerning Minnesotans' access to health care?
So this is a really difficult one. I have a son that has had 3 years of chemo and a year of skin radiation, and so health care is super important to me. You never know when something is going to happen, right? For cancer, there have been, last 2018, there was 9,000 recorded cancer deaths. COVID so far has 2,000 deaths. I hope that's right. I might be off. So I think it's really important that we have single-payer health care, full Minnesota care for every person that lives in Minnesota, because we never know what's going to happen. Families shouldn't have to go bankrupt. They shouldn't have to worry about whether or not they can go get a COVID test for a decent price. They shouldn't have to worry about whether or not they can get the vaccine that can keep our communities safe. So this would also relieve the stress on small businesses. A lot of times there are small businesses where they have to hire a couple part-time employees. And that can change with having health care for everybody.
Thank you. Ben?
When it comes to healthcare, there are honestly really only two options. The first option is to guarantee coverage to everybody, and the other option is to let people die because they can't afford to see a doctor. Now, I think most people would agree that poverty should not be a death sentence, not even poverty. And we're talking in like middle-class Americans. The truth is, most middle-class Americans, if they get something like cancer, they will go bankrupt. That is the reality that a lot of people are living in today, especially if you look at our elder care situation in Minnesota. One of the big issues that exists today is people lose their family homes. They lose all the wealth that they've accumulated over their lives, and they can't pass down anything to their children because they are literally forced to go down to zero before they can get like state benefits or anything like that. And that's really, it's really frustrating. And a lot of us have lost family members to things that are so easily preventable, and all that would have opened up, right, that would have saved their lives if we open up the opportunity for them to just go and be able to see a doctor. And so ultimately, that is why I believe in a single-payer healthcare plan. And the good news is that plan already exists. State Senator John Marty wrote up that plan a long time ago, and it would actually save our state money by cutting insurance company profits out of the loop. That would be savings into your pocket.
Thank you. And Ben, we'll go to you for this question. What is your position on restoring voting rights to people who have been convicted of a felony once they are out of prison and on probation?
Yeah, I actually think we should go one step further. Because one of the things we also need to acknowledge is that when Richard Nixon started the war on drugs, he actually explicitly stated, and some of his former advisors have come out and explicitly stated that the entire purpose of the war on drugs, was to jail black youth, specifically so that they wouldn't be voting for him and his administration. Anybody that they thought might be anti-war, they decided to target with their war on drugs. And you can see that in the way that various police systems are funded across our country, how that is targeted. And so ultimately, not only do we need to restore the right to vote to former felons, right, but we also should restore the right to vote to people who are incarcerated. Because when you strip the right to vote away from literally anybody, especially when you strip the right to vote away from incarcerated persons, what you do is you create a vile incentive for people to jail people for political purposes as an electoral strategy. And unfortunately, that is what's been going on for the past 30, 40 years here in the United States. And that's one of those things that it's just fundamentally unacceptable. It's fundamentally unacceptable that we have here in the United States the most amount of prisoners, literally more prisoners than any other country in the entire world. We have 1/4 of all the prisoners in the entire world, and we are only 5% of the population. And that's not freedom. That is not freedom.
Thank you. Katy.
Voting is the foundation. Voting is the foundation of our democracy. Right now, I feel that we do not live in a republic. We live in an oligarchy in which the richest people, the 1%, are buying our elections, buying the votes through advertising and swaying of opinions. And it's got to stop. If we empower people to vote that are vulnerable adults, that are in the prison system, that are definitely, if they are, overseas, we need to make that voting available and easy to do. I do support making sure that incarcerated people are able to vote, and that would include people that are in facilities for mental challenges. So, gotta vote. It's important stuff.
Thank you. And Katy, back to you again. What should the legislature do, if anything, concerning police accountability and reform to prevent unnecessary deaths, particularly among African Americans?
So, my dad was a police officer, and so I have a lot of conflicting issues or feelings surrounding this. My belief is that the community should decide how they want their policing to work. So in Painesville, where I live, our chief is great. We have really great police officers, and I support them. In different communities, they need to have that voice. They need to have that ability to say, this isn't working and we need something different. And that all starts with the community standing up and saying, this is not okay. It starts at the legislature. It starts by having these conversations person to person about what's working and what doesn't work. And we all need to be vigilant about being part of that discussion and pushing forward.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, definitely. And really there's a lot that could be done, and there's a lot that definitely needs to be done. And a lot of this I'll speak from my experiences as somebody who's in the military. I was in the Air Force active duty for 4 years. And one of the things that exists there is there are inspectors general who are responsible for doing investigations and things like that of wrongdoing. And they are very separate entities, right? It would be ridiculous for me to assume that my supervisor is going to be impartial in investigating me, right? We might be friends. We might, be pretty close and know each other and have maybe too much understanding And so that is one thing that we definitely need is an independent board that runs across the entire state that is responsible for evaluating claims of misconduct and things to that effect. I also think that really the job of policing needs to be broken down into several different jobs, right? Because most of what a police officer actually responds to is not violent crime. Most of what they respond to is maybe domestic disputes, speeding tickets, what have you. A lot of things that involve different skill sets. And so ultimately, if you break down the job into several different components, you can make sure that everybody who's responding to things, if somebody's responding to somebody in the community who's having a mental health crisis or somebody who is struggling with homelessness, that requires a fundamentally different skill set than somebody who's being like a member of a SWAT team. Yeah.
Thank you. Ben, share your ideas about how the state legislature can enhance the respectful and fair treatment of women and minorities.
Yeah, definitely. This is another thing where there really is kind of a lot to say. So specifically in regards to women, one of the things that we can do is just pass the Equal Rights Amendment. It's kind of strange to think that it hasn't gotten there yet. It's weird. You think in the year 2020 we'd already be there. There's definitely a lot more that can be done. And especially when it comes to addressing racial inequality, I feel like there's this long history of sort of bringing in members of the community to the legislature, and listening to them for like half an hour, and then and basically walking away from the conversation without representatives actually taking anything into consideration. I think ultimately any piece of legislation, especially any piece of legislation that would come out of my office that has anything to do with racial justice or gender justice, it would have been past the eyes of people who are deeply involved in the community long before it would reach the floor. And there's a very important reason for that. Is because we truly don't understand the lives of people who walk different lives, right? People with different lives are under different conditions, right? People of color walking on the street have a different experience with other people around them than I do. And one of the realities that we live in is that there's sort of a lot of racism and sexism that kind of exist in society that go hidden. And so we need to make sure that any policy really involves their viewpoint when it's being drafted.
Thank you. Katy.
Ben is so great. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. Share your ideas about how the state legislature can enhance the respectful and fair treatment of women and minorities.
So, as a woman in a very male-dominated industry, I know that there is a lot of work to be done. As a person who is white and of Asian descent and Spanish, I know that there is rampant racism as well. And so there's a lot of work to be done. Because I grew up in a white family, half white, because I grew up in a generally white family and white community, I don't have the same experience as somebody who is not. And so we really need to have those conversations, like Ben had said, with the people that are experiencing these things. And then we need to make sure that we bring that information back to the legislature and we tell them what needs to happen. So that needs to be done by a strong voice. I would say a strong woman that can really take on the Minnesota House and say these are the things that need to change. And I think that we need to have those conversations, and not just on the Democrat side, but also on the Republican side, and there needs to be some bridging of that knowledge, and then also bringing people in to tell their stories as well. So we got a lot of work to do.
Thank you. And Katy, I'm going to come to you for our final question. What are some unique issues that affect your constituents in District 13 which might not have the same priorities statewide?
So there's a lot of things that rurally that we are really struggling with that are not necessarily in the big cities. And like I mentioned before, internet is a huge issue, because in order to have the kids have the resources that they need, they really need internet. The other things that we need is to make sure that we have high-paying jobs. If we're looking at bringing in any kind of technical jobs to Painesville or the rural communities, we need to have really fast internet. So fast internet is really going to make a huge difference in our rural communities. The other thing that we're really struggling with is farmland and loss of farmland. So we have farmers that are unable to pass their land to their children, to future generations, or maybe the children don't want to do farming anymore. The price of farmland has gotten so raised that a new farmer starting out without having it passed down generation to generation is pretty much priced out of becoming a farmer. And we need farmers to make the food that we have on our table every day, so that's super important.
Thank you. And Ben?
So when a lot of people talk about climate change, they typically talk about the things on the coast. They typically talk about the weather getting warmer and things like that. They talk about green energy. But one thing in particular that has been affecting Minnesota very significantly is a combination of soil erosion and flooding. That is kind of, farmers have been taking a hit. They've been taking a serious hit due to climate change. And one of the things that really needs to be done is we need to put a lot of time, effort, and money, right, into our farming communities to make sure that their farmland is being protected from things like soil erosion, to make sure that there's insurance programs for if they want to try innovative new strategies like no-till farming and other things like that, so that if they are taking a risk for the benefit of the environment, for the benefit of every single Minnesotan, and honestly everybody in the world, in order to develop like more sustainable farming practices, then we should ensure that as a state to make sure that they will always be able to put food on their table, because they are literally putting food onto our tables. And so that's one thing that I really think is worth touching on, is specifically the impact climate change is having here in our community, particularly in farming communities. Even just the increase in temperature is predicted to reduce yields by about 5% over the next decade. And a 5% reduction in yields over a decade it's not great.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our time for questions, and we'll begin closing statements. You will each have 1 minute to summarize why you believe your qualifications are well matched with the requirements of serving as a Minnesota legislator. And we will start with Ben.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm an Air Force veteran. I spent 4 years active duty as an intelligence analyst, and I've spent about 4 years in the Air National Guard in cybersecurity. My undergraduate degree is in social sciences. My master's degree that I'm finishing in about a month is in biosecurity and biodefense. And to say the very least, it's a pretty eclectic sort of background. And I'm kind of proud of that, because I've experienced with a lot of different issues and topics, and specifically how they impact our community and other communities around us. And so I honestly think I'm the best person to represent this district, specifically because of the intersection of all the different experiences that I've had, and my desire to make sure that I use all this knowledge to really benefit the working class people here in our district.
Thank you. And Katy?
So I am definitely the best person to represent 13A. I am a mom, a strong woman, and I'm pretty loud, so I can make quite a ruckus when something needs to happen and something needs to change. And my goal is to really make sure that I'm representing the farmers and the families and the small businesses. I was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I am not well off by any means, and so I can really be a voice for the people and not the corporations. So I am asking your vote, and I'm asking for you to check out my website and get involved in the political process and learn as much as you can and really be a force of change wherever you can be. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you to members of the general public for emailing questions. Thank you to each of the candidates for running for public office and for participating in this forum. Thank you to the City of Sartell for use of this room. A link to a recording of this event will be posted on the League of Women Voters St. Cloud Area website, lwvsca.org. The views expressed in this forum are those of the candidates, not those of the sponsor. Sponsorship of this forum is not an endorsement by the sponsor of any candidates. Now it's up to voters. I hope you continue to become informed about candidates and issues. Let your voices be heard by voting. Candidates, good luck on November 3rd.